Senator Mark Warner proposed an amendment to the Inflation Reduction Act on the Senate floor Sunday. Warner described his amendment as being the last hurdle to allow the Senate, quote, to move forward on this historic legislation on drug prices, climate change, reform the tax code, and bringing down inflation and making sure we've got a true, comprehensive energy policy. The amendment did ultimately pass. All 50 Senate Democrats voted for the amendment, and all 50 Republicans voted against it, with Vice President Kamala Harris, as President of the Senate, casting the tie-breaking vote.
Amendment number.
Unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Without objection.
Mr. President, the end is near. I hope. For those of us on this side of the aisle who've worked long and hard, this is the last substantive action we have to take before final passage of a historic piece of legislation. Recognizing, and I want to thank the senators on both sides of the aisle for the productive discussions in the last vote on a difficult issue that my amendment would address. My amendment would simply strike the offset in the previous amendment, known as the state and local tax deduction, and replace it with a 2-year extension of a so-called loss limitation policy that has bipartisan support over many years. This was first employed under President Trump, was then employed by the Democrats. Everyone on this side of the aisle has voted for this pay for. $52 billion, which more than offsets the $35 billion that were taken from the previous amendment. This amendment will allow us to move forward on this historic legislation on drug prices, climate change, reform the tax code, and bringing down inflation and making sure we've got a true comprehensive energy policy. I urge all my colleagues to support the amendment.
The senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I would urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. The amendment we just voted on and passed has an offset in there, and it's a provision that works very, very well and covers getting rid of this tax on private equity, on small businesses and larger businesses in this country. And what the senator from Virginia is proposing is an offset loss limitation, and he's right, we have voted for it. We voted for it because we put it in the tax bill in 2017 as an offset, and what it offset and paid for was the 199A deduction that benefits all our pass-through businesses, small businesses across this country, which expires in 2026. That very offset is how we're going to pay for extending the 199A deduction for pass-through businesses in this country. So if you want to rob it and use it here, it's not going to be available when it comes time to help out those small businesses, all of whom you represent, pass-through businesses across this country. The offset, the pay-for, in my amendment, is the right way to do this. I urge you to oppose the amendment.
Mr. President, do I have any time remaining?
All time has expired.
I'd urge adoption of the amendment.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Boozman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. No. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. No. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Daines. No. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Kane, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lujan, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Tester, Van Hollen, Warner, Warnock, Warren, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cassidy, Collins, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hawley, Hoeven, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Lankford, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Paul, Portman, Risch, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Lujan, aye.
Ready? Okay. On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative and the amendment is agreed to.